Welcome to everyone that has joined us. I am Tanya Lauder. I'm the Director of Finance for CFHA. I am here to say thank you for joining us. We're delighted for the speakers who will be leading the conversation today, and I will turn it over to our community conversation facilitators, Stacy, Agosto.
Thank you, Tanya. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. If you've been able to join last month's conversation, this is a little bit of an extension. We're going to be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and upcoming changes that we might foresee with the change of administration. This was really taken from some language from Project 2025 that specifically mentions and recommends that these initiatives be abandoned with the next administration. So that, of course, means these things may or may not be adopted, but for full transparency, that is the language that is being recommended. Before I introduce just our super participants, I wanted to make a comment about these conversations. We're glad you're here and want as much participation as you're comfortable with. But just keep in mind, these are not confidential conversations, necessarily private conversations. So just sort of be aware of that as you are participating in that, given your workplace, your state, and anything you feel comfortable sharing. So with that, we have a couple or a few participants on the call that I can introduce. So we have Deepu George, Naftali Serrano, and Jason Herndon from CFHA Leadership. And I believe Gretchen Buchanan is also on the call, who is representing a committee with CFHA that is tasked with sort of embodying DEI initiatives and really actualizing those for CFHA. But of course, everyone is welcome to participate. So just want to kick off the conversation in terms of any thoughts people have initially. Naftali, maybe you want to share some of your ideas on DEI initiatives.
Sure, I'll jump in, but I also want to just encourage people to jump in. I'm mostly interested, honestly, in hearing from you all and what your concerns are, just so that we know how to be responsive to you as an organization, and just for my own education, because your particular situations could look really, really different. One of the things I learned in this process is that several folks reached out and were like, yeah, it's not going to be much different for us. Our state is already like this, right? And there are already restrictions in our state. So I think we could probably learn from the folks in those states that already have been under administrations that are restricting language, that are potentially restricting funding, or otherwise, trying to rework the dynamic around DEI. I think the global thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up and listen to you all, is I think, like everything else, this presents an opportunity for us to think about the outcomes that we're hoping to get, right? I don't think this means we try to abandon outcomes that we want, whether they're patient level outcomes, workforce level outcomes, population-specific outcomes. We hold true to our values. We hold true to the things that we think are important for good healthcare, for good healthcare teams, for good organizational development. And so I think we need to focus in on the outcomes and then look at our methodology, because really a lot of the stuff that I saw that Stacy sent out about the Project 2025 stuff was not restricting outcomes. It was restricting the language and methods by which you could achieve those outcomes, right? So I think that's one frame that I'm bringing to the conversation. And the last thing I'll say is just a lot of empathy, because I did hear some stories of at least one CFHA member who because of the state she lives in, feels extremely restricted in terms of what she can do in her state. So this is affecting people personally. Like, people are afraid to lose their jobs because they don't want to say the wrong thing. And that's a space that I'm not used to inhabiting, to be honest. I don't know how to inhabit that space yet. I don't know that I want to learn how to inhabit that space, but I'm just being honest with you. I don't know how to grapple with that. This is a very new feeling to actually feel constrained even by how we speak about things. So those are just some initial thoughts. Love to hear from the rest of you. And
Actually, I just kind of jumping off of what you said, I think reflecting on that and thinking about how what we say and the terms that we use could result in losing jobs and things like that. I think I always kind of go on the assumption that you know, do no harm and not, you know, not hurting people with my language would mean that I would keep my job, and then yet this is almost like the opposite of that, you know, it's flipping everything on its head and saying, you know, you can't fight for justice, you can't fight for equity, you can't, like, all the things that are good, don't do that, don't do good things, don't talk about, or you can do them maybe, but don't talk about them. Yeah, it kind of, and fortunately for me, I'm in Minnesota, and so I'm not anticipating anything on the state level, but I work in a very federally funded environment, so I do anticipate having some significant changes in how I operate in my work as well. I know, so for those of you who aren't familiar with the Just Medicine Committee of CFHA, I'm one of the co-chairs, the outgoing co-chair actually. We'll have a new co-chair coming on next year, and she's experienced some already. She lives in a state that's much more restrictive and has experienced a lot of this already. So hearing from her, you know, the environment of the impact that these types of policies has is sobering.
Thank you, Gretchen, for sharing that. And Naftali, Deepu, you and I had a conversation, and you are in a state where you've been experiencing this already, as others have mentioned. Do you want to kind of share your perspective on things, how you've been managing?
Sure. I mean, I can speak from just my own personal consternation in having to kind of go through some kind of a training that basically applies the law and having to kind of quote unquote abide by it and kind of living through that. So I live in Texas, so it's not a surprise to anyone. Texas is a complicated state and a regressive state in many ways in terms of progressive policies and agenda, whether it's healthcare or otherwise. And so 2 years ago, I think the bill was passed to abolish all DEI related activities and positions and commitments that state institutions have made towards that. So it's abolishing all DEI focused training, content, those kinds of conversations within a campus. And so we as employees have to kind of abide by that and thinking about that. So as those things were coming down, you know, I think it removes institutional I guess, infrastructure that may have served some function. And, you know, in some spaces, you might think, what did the DEI office do? And in some cases, they're like, oh my God, we're really going to miss this space, right? So I think even in institutions where there was DEI focused work, the impact and the effect of it may have been mixed. And you can kind of review your own institution to see what the office is engaged in and how you want to get involved. I think for me personally, it's been just really thinking about what values do I believe in that is important for a equitable, just environment around me, and what can I do within my own personal agency to ensure that in the positions of power or privilege that I have, can I enforce, speak for, and advocate for those things, even if that might put me at risk? And I think those are some of the harder conversations that I've had with a few of my colleagues here. It's just like really thinking about, am I willing to speak up for something when I see it? And my internal convictions says yes, and I hope I have the words and the courage to do it as well as I imagine that I can do it in those particular moments. So that's one way that I've been thinking about it. The other framework, if that might be helpful for folks to think about, is thinking about the history of these metrics related to DEI and how that has functioned over the years in the United States itself in general, and then in particular how that has kind of taken on a life of its own over the last several years, starting with COVID and the George Floyd events and all of that. And there is a framework that Jason and I had the chance to think about together, and we published that few Family Systems and Health journals ago, where we talked about what are the things that what things has DEI has gotten us to do so far, and what might be the potential limitations of considering relying on that framework in a way to kind of think about the bigger things that we want to see in the world, right? Because I think ultimately companies and institutions may have fallen on the performative side of DEI without really thinking about the relational, the existential implications of what DEI is asking for. In one of my former institutions that I was at, there was a large effort to recruit more minority students to be part of the university, and they did a fantastic job at recruiting more and more students. But were they able to retain all of them? And the answer was no, right? Because they hit the metrics in terms of diversity, but the environment did not shift one bit in creating belonging, right? So when we think about diversity, if we just ensure the numbers, but we don't rewire and rethink how do we become a community of belonging, that everybody that walks through the door feels safe psychologically, physically, then we may have lost a battle on that front. Does that make sense? Like we've diagnosed the problem correctly, but we haven't provided the right treatment. And then the other part that we thought about is this idea of dignity. So in the article, we basically take a very simple approach to that and just say that dignity is you just showing up, right? Nothing else is needed to justify your existence in the room or in the conversation. And so that's the other thing. What are the ways that we need to think about providing spaces where dignity is just the thing that we safeguard as we move forward for everybody? And then the other thing that we talk about in that is justice, right? It's like, how do we ensure on our personal and collective sense that we are fighting for justice and repairing where power brokers have, or power is centered around few brokers and not everybody else. And Jason probably can speak a little bit more to this before he has to sign off. He brought in also a very powerful framing around what does it take to be allies versus advocates. I think that it's two different functions. Allies, you're like, yeah, I'm here with you, right? Like you hear some kind of a misogynistic, racist comment at work, and then you go back to that person that might have been impacted by it and say, man, I really feel you on that one, and that was a horrible thing to hear or say or whatever. So that's being an ally, where your sense of power and privilege is not risked at all, versus where you're an advocate, which is in that moment, you muster up courage and fumbling words to say something against what was just being said. and therefore you are risking your comfort and your privilege and your power and position in the system in order to bring a more equitable, just world, right? And so that's one way that I've been thinking about it over the last year. We were able to kind of think more strategically and write about it. And Jason, I'll let you kind of get your thoughts out on that too. Ebony Winford is the one who really turned us on to thinking about it that way. So I don't want to take any credit for coming up with that, but then there's a lot of published stuff out there.
Absolutely. I think in that same vein, I would say that, Amber Cabral, who is an author and DEI consultant, is where I got this idea about sort of what is the difference here between approaches to allyship and approaches to advocacy. And, I think you described it really well. I think that what I would add is there are times when allyship is the right move, right? There are times when advocacy is the right move. I think that it's important for us to keep in mind, particularly as we think about, if you're a person who endorses a variety of intersecting identities, right, that often we feel obligated, right, to maybe move into a place of advocacy or allyship, right? Even when you are tired and angry and ready to sit down, right, and just sort of keep to yourself. And so I want to hold space for and remind us all that, these are choices, right, that we are free to make or not make, right? It is your choice, my choice, our choice to advocate, to ally, right? I do think that what is helpful to me is to think about the differential benefit of allyship versus advocacy, right? Is it helpful to so when I worked in a university, oftentimes, right? Like sometimes I was an ally to my female colleagues, sometimes I was an advocate to my female colleagues. And it was useful to me to think about like what did they feel like might be most beneficial in this moment? Right. And so many of these things just have nuance to them, right? Like how do I think about and talk about, so let me take a step back and say, I think that the decision on whether to be an ally or an advocate also has to be made within community. Right. So I think that there are sometimes struggle when we say, I've decided that this is the best strategy for you. I haven't really talked to you about that or asked you about that, right? Or asked you what you would like. Right. And so I remember talking to some of my colleagues around like, this thing has happened before. This colleague has sort of spoken to you in a way that feels inappropriate, whatever, how would you like me to show up? Right. And I think that is a question that we can ask each other more often, right, when we are in community, right, as opposed to sort of saying like, I've decided that it is my place to swoop in as the man and rescue you, right, my female colleague, regardless of whether you want the optics of that to occur in this meeting or whatever it is, right? And so, yeah, I think that I would add that part, that sort of thinking about these things within community, right, and within conversation, within relationship, with one another, to figure out, when these things occur, how would you like me to show up for you? How can I support you? Would you prefer that I support you sort of behind the scenes and sort of find you after something happens and say, that was really messed up, but I'm sorry that it happened. And I heard it. I want to acknowledge that, you're not crazy. This thing is a thing that happened, right? Versus when is it helpful for you, for me to stand up like in the moment, right, and support you sort of openly and clearly in that kind of way. So I think I would add that in. Yeah, I appreciate being able to share this space with everybody.
And thanks for that, Jason. That was really helpful. I think it brings to mind what you're saying, also brings to mind, I think, a set of skills that we all will need to develop in order to enter those spaces. Because if you're going to advocate, you're going to have to advocate in a way that's effective, right? And if you're going to sort of have allyship, you also have to be effective. And in this environment, I think one of those skills, not the only skill, but one of them that I've been thinking about a lot about, which is really interesting as a minority myself, who's aware of how I have to do this in a variety of settings and have in my life, is code switching. So in a sense, what this challenge presents, this environment, is another opportunity to learn how to do code switching in a different environment. Because if I'm going to an administrator to talk about things, I need to use language that will be heard effectively. Whether that feels good or not, it may not feel good, but I think the reality is that that's the skill that we need, right? It is a form of code switching. So I did a little exercise with ChatGPT prior to this meeting, actually, to just talk it through with ChatGPT a little bit and have it help me change some of the language. And it was interesting, some of the, like, for example, ChatGPT recommended, instead of using unconscious bias, right? So like if we go to an administrator and start talking about unconscious bias, then we're in an academic institution where you're sort of not allowed to be talking about unconscious bias anymore, right? We may use terms like increasing awareness or communication skills and increasing better communication, increasing better teamwork. So I think we'll need to learn to adopt language with certain individuals or power structures that focus in on those outcomes and that don't automatically just trigger stuff, right? For individuals who are going, or systems that are going to be triggerable. And there's certainly a part of that. As someone, if you are a minority, you understand what code switching is. And sometimes code switching just feels fine. It's neutral, right? It's just like what you do. You talk to your white friends differently than you talk to your, sort of homies at back home, right? And some of it's fine. Some of it feels a little yucky because you're like, I wish I didn't have to hide, stuff. But it's just a skill. Like, you have to learn it. At least as a minority in the United States, you just have to learn code switching. It's just part of your life, part of your upbringing. And I feel like this is, again, a skill we're going to have to learn as we enter different spaces, and do so with great wisdom, with the intent. I've been kind of working my way through the writings of Martin Luther King Jr. as a kind of a way of just meditating on what his approach to life was. And I've been doing that for like the last year and a half, just slowly going through different writings. And one of the things that I think stands out to me about his particular approach to all of these justice issues is that he always sought to win over those who he or they perceived as enemies. Like, that was his goal. His goal was, I need to win them over. They need to be part of my tribe. I can't stand in over and against. I will stand in for justice, and I'll do that. But I ultimately want to win them over. And I think one thing I will say that we have to be honest about is, I'm not like, what we have done with DEI in the language has not always been effective at winning people over. And I think we have to be honest about that. And we have to say, well, okay, so what can we change? Not with the outcomes, but what could we change with the language? What skills could we use to bridge the gap with individuals who are not where we are when it comes to equity and justice issues? And I think those are things that we're going to have to work on intentionally to bridge that gap between us and then the power structures and the communities that are not aligned with the intentions of DEI stuff.
I'd like to sort of add on top of that, something that I find really helpful in thinking through that too, again, from Amber Cabral, is this sense of, she encourages us all, when we do this work and are in this work, to make space for imperfection. And I think she goes on to sort of make the distinction that imperfection can acknowledge that we are, as you said, all on our own sort of journey, right? As it relates to, pick which term, cultural competency, multicultural values, right? The multicultural orientation, right? DEI, DBJ, right? We're all sort of moving down our own sort of journey at our own pace, Sometimes that pace is slower than others might like. Sometimes it's faster than others are prepared for, right? A part of how we can sort of bridge that gap is to make space for imperfection, which is we recognize that sometimes people who maybe aren't as far along as we are say things, right, or do things unintentionally, and that matters, right? And there might be space for some education, right, that comes from a place of love, right? And what I appreciate about what she's saying there too, is that making space for imperfection is not the same as sitting quietly while people intentionally do and say cruel, hurtful, and offensive things. Right. And so like that's not necessarily like the request, right? That, oh, you make space for imperfection by like letting people just make racial slurs, right? Or be transphobic, right? Or whatever it is, right? Those aren't necessarily the same things, and we can respond to those instances in different ways, while also sort of holding true, right, to these values, right, and that idea. So yeah, it's another thing that sort of came up for me that I find really helpful in sort of thinking through like when and how sometimes my mouth is a little slick, right? So people who know me know that like kind of quietly, right? And so like when and how do I need to say things in a certain way, right? Do I need to code switch and like clean stuff up, right? Like how do I approach that? And that has been a useful framework for me in thinking through like what version of Jason needs to show up in this conversation.
Thank you for everybody who's shared a perspective. I want to just leave a little bit of space for folks who maybe are off camera, who haven't shared. Really curious why you joined, what questions are on your mind. You don't necessarily have to have a position on this. A lot of us are sort of reading and thinking about it as we go along and talking. So if you want to drop in the chat questions, why you came today, what you were hoping to hear, things that are not fully formulated are okay too. I just want to open that to people that are not necessarily dubbed our super participants. Maybe folks were hoping for a podcast type environment. That's fine too.
Well, while people are kind of thinking about
sorry,
that.
someone came off, Diana came off mute.
Oh,
Sorry.
go ahead, yeah.
Yes, sorry. So good afternoon, everyone. I am Diana Gampa del Rosario, and I am calling out of San Antonio, Texas. Some of you are very familiar. Seem very familiar to me from the conference that we just had down here. And my reason for jumping on, and once again, I thank you, Deepu George, for your information, because as you all know, it should not be a surprise that, Texas is already a conservative state on a good day. And I live in an area between in San Antonio, Austin area where our mindset seems to be a little bit different than most of Texas, but we still have the same laws and guidelines that we have to abide by behavioral health. So I'm just wanting to get a sense from, what all of y'all have discussed on how we can work, and was mentioned more an alliance with helping our patients with the diverse issues that may be occurring in the next few years, and just getting the ideas and how to work within the system and then how to advocate at the system. So that's kind of why I jumped in, how I would, the way it is in Texas, just the thought of even more conservative or more strict guidelines makes me a little nervous. So I just wanted to get other perspectives.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And in the chat, someone shared that they are here because they're not sure what to expect. So they're learning by listening. Their FQHC has a DE&I council, and they want to feel a little more educated when they go into the meeting this afternoon. And other folks are saying, which this has been on my mind too, just to help decatastrophize changes that may or may not happen, some concrete things that people can do to move forward and feel a little more grounded. And that, I agree, Nicole, that's very grounding, just to be in community with other people listening and sharing around these topics.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole, for that comment. I think there's a lot, again, sometimes I'm like, man, am I like Mr. Toxic Positivity sometimes, but like I do see these things oftentimes as opportunities, these times of disruption. George Floyd, as horrible, as horrific as that was, changed my world and changed the world around me in so many positive ways. So these conversations that particularly African Americans have been trying to have for decades, at least the decades of my existence, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, I know from friends, and like getting these conversations out was so difficult. Past George Floyd, we started having really in-depth conversations that introduced these concepts of like allyship, right? And then we've evolved from there, introduced all forms in healthcare in a way. There's a huge push, even though the incident itself wasn't specifically related to healthcare. In healthcare, we saw a tremendous push for workforce development, diversification, for the development of DEI committees. All these DEI committees, a lot of them started past George Floyd, right? So there was a lot of that happened there. And I'm hopeful, Nicole, that one of the positive things that happens is that because we're forced to, in a sense, be more conscious and intentional about our values, that we then are more persistent and strategic, and when necessary, subversive in smart ways about how to promote these values, and how to continue to win over more of those folks on the other side of this issue, or who perceive themselves to be on the other side of this issue, to a broader, larger coalition of people that stand up for, in our case, healthcare, equity, justice. So that's what helps me feel like, okay, there are some things that we can control in our environment and some things that we can look forward to doing as long as we're able to or willing to engage the process in a very intentional way.
I wonder if folks feel like DEI initiatives have been working. To Deepu, your point about performative measures, I was at an organization that was very excited to support Pride Month and did some pretty embarrassing and off-the-wall things to do that in the name of DEI. And so I wonder a little bit about, where DEI has been taken, and if this could offer, actually, like to your point, Natalia, an opportunity for some real vision into that. If anything, for me, consciousness raising has been very effective. And the more people that understand health inequities among people of color, among LGBT folks, among women, that really, I think, has been successful. And that's why we're seeing such a backlash against it. And so to me, what are the next steps in healthcare? To me, it would be continued focus on those health inequities. And how do we move the needle there, as opposed to putting together a queer playlist for Pride Month, right? So I wonder about that. It might be a controversial question, but I do wonder if folks feel like DEI initiatives that they've seen have actually worked, and if there might be an opportunity for something different.
I'll say it quickly and then I have to run. But I mean, I do think that there are other things that I think we can be, and maybe should be, suspicious, right, of the commodification, right, of DEI, right? Like, I don't need a t-shirt with Obama and MLK and Malcolm X, right, from Target, right? Like, I would like the Voting Rights Act to pass, right? And so I think that, it feels easy sometimes, right, to get to this place where it's like, oh, well, like, this is something, right? That something is better than nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I think that that is true, right? I think anytime we are leaning on sort of the creation of community, right? The protection of community, right? I think, there's a question earlier about like, what is something that we can do with our patients, our clients, sort of however you refer to them, community members, right? As we think about, policies and that kind of thing. And so part of it, one thought that I had is sort of like, it pushes me to think about like, how often does my life and the lives of people that I care about actually intersect with federal policy, right? State level policy, and then when and where can we advocate, right, around those types of things. But I think too that there are definitely things that we can do differently, right? I think sort of like when we're able to move the work forward with policy change, right, with advocacy, with whatever, like those are certainly more preferable, I think, than right, like the playlist that you mentioned is a really great example, right? As a like people are somehow incapable of making their own playlists, right? Yeah, I think I'm still sort of putting all those pieces together in my own mind, right, around sort of like what does it mean to sort of be active in this time, or activist, maybe that's a better way of saying it. What does it mean to be activist, right, like in this time, in a way that feels worthwhile and meaningful?
I'd say I do love a queer playlist, but there are no queer people involved in putting together the playlist.
Yes,
It's very
right.
stereotypical, et cetera, et
No
cetera.
shade to queer
Yeah.
playlists. You're absolutely
Right.
yeah.
It's kind of like, what? Okay. Maria, did you want to jump in?
Yes. I think in a way the interventions don't work because they are interventions. They are oriented to change people's behaviors regardless of the interior of the person, the status of the psychology of the person, or I don't know, what's the best way to describe it, but my feeling is that that's why is a misunderstanding of the processes of how people change. And I think we are in a unique position to inform the initiatives with what we know about psychology, how our minds work and how people really change. So that's my 2 cents.
I really agree with Maria there. Something that I've found valuable in those spaces, I don't know if it's the best approach, but I found valuable is when you bring in a subject matter expert and not just someone who is researching and trying to be a subject matter expert on certain topics, or people who have lived experiences. I think there's a lot of power in storytelling. I'm not sure what that'll look like in the next couple of years and how comfortable people will be being subject matter experts on certain topics and speaking openly and sharing certain stories. So I think there's going to need to be some mindfulness there and some pivoting and trying to be creative in how we talk about these things and how people talk about things. But I really do think there's a lot of power. Like I've had some great spaces where instead of having someone talk and present on what peer counseling is, have a peer counsel come in and talk about what got them to become a peer counsel, what their background and their life story is. And then the impact they in turn then later had on other people. And I thought that that was a really rewarding experience. And I've seen that in other environments for different populations and for different subject matters. So I think that that has been really valuable as a learner and someone who, stands in the position of advocate in different stances sometimes, and help me to educate myself. But I also think challenging people to educate themselves still is really important, because I think it could burn out whatever group you're trying to advocate for to continuously put them in the position of teacher. While they probably put a lot of responsibility on themselves for that, I think it's really important that we all take that stance as well as constant learners, and forming activities that encourages that learning and challenges people to teach themselves a little bit can be helpful, I think.
That's great. Thank you, Nicole. I want to lift up a question in the chat to get people's ideas. That someone is wondering on strategies that we might be able to talk about to shift the culture when the folks in power are cis white men. Any sort of thoughts on DE&I hiring for positions of power, centering health equity as an organizational goal? and how we might sort of think about that.
Yeah, so I said a little bit about this in the chat, but I think it can be really helpful. A lot of times what I think of, thinking about outcomes and goals of like, what do you want to accomplish? You want to accomplish diverse hiring or, diverse, welcoming culture for a diverse staff, and helping these people in leadership who may just have a lot of blind spots and not have taken time to reflect on their status and the positivity that diversity can bring, helping them think through their, the goals of the organization and helping them kind of expand, the ways in which they see, not even depending on the environment, if you can't even really talk about diversity in hiring, but you could still say, amongst these candidates, this candidate could help us achieve our goals in this way, and this candidate could help us achieve our goals in this way. They have these skills, they have this perspective of, this customer base that we have been trying to reach, or this, there's a lot of our clients are, asking for these features or things like that. And so, kind of just tying that to the goals of the organization and thinking creatively about ways that maybe the leadership hasn't thought about these people being able to achieve the goals effectively.
Yeah, to Gretchen's point, this is sort of what I was talking about with code switching, right? It's really just understanding how to, it's not that much different than the work we have to do with integrated behavioral health in a way, right? Where we code switch when we're talking to a CEO or a CMO, we try to speak their language, in other words, right? And the language of upper leadership in healthcare is typically data-driven, outcomes-driven, strategic goal-driven. And again, I think this is a really good opportunity for us to get very good at speaking that language and tying it into the outcomes that we want to see related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those outcomes should be related to the overall mission of an organization in a substantive way. We don't want diversity for diversity's sake. We want it because it does something for us, right? So we have to then operationalize, well, what does having Latina women leadership in our organization do for us, right? So if I'm going to advocate for it, that's the work I need to do to say, why would I advocate for that? What would that do for the organization? How does that tie into our outcomes? How does that tie into our strategic plan? How does it tie into our customer base? And then I can use that language more effectively with individuals who, and Gretchen, you said it really well, I think, like they haven't done the pre-work to think about their own world and how they abide in their world. That's fine. I hope it's not a prerequisite for change that every single person has to do that to the extent that maybe I've had to, right? But we can be convincing using their own frameworks. And then, the trajectory of an organization over time can change as you then have more diverse leadership and voices at the peer level, where the CEO is maybe then interfacing with a director of HR or a director of behavioral health who is from a different background. Then you see larger, more institutional changes in culture over time. But that change is not something we want to wait for, because that's 20, 30 years. Like that's the amount of time it takes for that kind of change to take place, right? Yeah.
I just want to add, I wrote this in the chat as well, but I do think a lot of times our goals are actually more aligned than we realize. I think, most people are good and want good things for themselves and for other people. And if we can figure out, the essence of the goal, then I think we can align ourselves with the essence of that goal and bring it to light in the conversation. I mean, I think a lot of the backlash of DEI is, you know, towards DEI is, you know, there's certainly undercurrents of racism and homophobia and that kind of thing. But I do think there is a sense of people feeling a lack of fairness and a lack of, you know, not feeling like they are being considered, and feeling heard about that. And so, you know, I think if we just see the humanity in the people that we're working with and in the people who are feeling this way, and see if we can align together towards a future where everybody really feels included and that they belong.
I'd like to just co-sign what Gretchen is saying. She has some incredible insight. Some of the best advice I ever got from a boss when he explained how he was able to get the things accomplished that he wanted to accomplish was that I've got friends on both sides of the aisle. Mm. It did not matter who was in charge from the perspective of whether somebody was progressive or more conservative. He had friends on both sides of the aisle, and his philosophy was always that he would treat both sides of the issue fairly, and that he would always adhere to best professional practices and standards, no matter which side he dealt with. So that it became very difficult for someone to say, yeah, but, and of course somebody can always do that, but it then becomes, you know, something that is demonstrably unfair, unethical, or just plain dirty when those buts get thrown in there. As long as he was adhering to those best professional practices and standards, and as long as he was fair with everyone that he dealt with, regardless to what perspective they took on the issue, he was always able to build bridges and get those aligned goals and values, and get those things that he wanted to do to move forward within his professional spectrum. And I think that those things, they served me well, at least as well as they've served him.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Any other thoughts, or folks want to jump in?
I'm just curious from anybody in the group, but particularly the folks from Texas who are here, just tangibly, when you write grants, do these restrictions change the way you write those grants, or have you found yourself having to think through this in a way to, because that's one area that I think in particular is likely to be affected at the federal level.
I think when we write grants, we cite the data, right? And the data is pretty profound about health inequities, especially for minority populations and health outcomes. And so I don't see that strategy changing. And I think, you know, in most of the things that we focus on, and whether it's patient outcomes or workforce development, our goal is to get the healthcare workforce ready for the realities of where they serve, and therefore where they serve is entrenched with these difficulties where there's disproportionate outcomes based on economic, race, gender kind of gradients of our public health infrastructure. And so that's what we've been doing for the past several years, and most of them have been federal grants, and even locally we haven't softened the arguments that we make to kind of like blunt out what might be considered DEI related.
Yeah, it's sort of an extension of what RJ said. in RJ's comments, I loved your comments about, stick to the best practices, right? Professional best practice. And, certainly a professional best practice for us in healthcare is stick to the evidence, right? And use data. And it's hard to combat data. Like if you're talking about maternal child health outcomes for African-American women, or individuals in certain socioeconomic classes, that's the data is the data.
I was just going to add, Deepu, that even there was a conversation that I think HRSA, our program officers, wanted to have with our other co-PI for a maternal health grant that we have. And we had to bring in like our vice president of governmental affairs because of the change in Texas that was pretty recent. And, they just kind of, they kept the governmental affairs personnel had to keep to their, like, this is what it is. But on the other end, we're like, this is the federally funded grant and these are the expectations we need to meet. And we just need to move forward, right? But will that change in the time at a federal level with time? That's the question. But again, just like Deepu said, we stick to the facts, we stick to the data, and we do as we do for our people, inclusive of all of our population.
And I think we also can get better at the other data. What are the interventions that work with our, minoritized populations? Because I think we have the data for what is happening, but not necessarily what we should do about it, because there is still that discrepancy between interventions for the population that is white and certain class. So let's do that.
I agree. Go ahead, Deepu.
I was just gonna say a lot of the things that Gretchen, RJ, Neftali, even when Lupita and Maria are kind of talking about brings me to something Neftali and I talked about probably like 2 years ago. And one of your framing, Neftali, was to kind of check with our targets and things that we want to do. Are we in the right relationship space in this process, right? And so sizing up the rightness of the relationship is a dynamic event, and at least in my view, and it's something that you continuously do, and that's where all the different skills of code switching and knowing the data and other things and kind of sticking to those evidence and best practices becomes easier to do. To RJ's comment about how his boss had friends on both sides, my sense is somewhere in that equation, this person had done a good job in being in right relationship with each other, whether that took honesty, whether that took disagreements. And to choose your point of what is the intervention? Well, when there isn't clear interventions, the right intervention is to be in relationship with that patient and their context and kind of figure out what might be useful from the principles that you already know, right? Because there aren't right interventions almost all the time for a lot of the populations that we work with. But I think most of it works because we're in relationship with them and we care. And so that's kind of where my mind goes with that.
So we've talked about a lot today. Good discussion, and I appreciate y'all being here. Some tactical things that have come through, I would say, know the climate of your state, right? We've talked about kind of where funding is coming from. I've heard other associations, PCAs thinking through, is our funding private and therefore will it be protected from some things? Is it state? Am I a more Democratic Republican state? Maybe that'll change some things and how we move forward in our work. And then we talked a lot about language today, code switching, in front of certain audiences or moving through spaces, what kinds of words are you using? And, looking at data as well, instead of sort of relying on emotion and just that these are the right things to do, getting really good at sort of knowing your data as well. Go ahead, Travis. I see you came off mute. Maybe not. Any last comments before we wrap, or anybody want to sort of share anything else?
I just want to thank everyone for making the effort to come out and have this conversation. I think, not that this is the metric for this, but I feel better just talking this out with you all.
Yeah.
I'm figuring this out as we go, and a lot of it still feels confusing and not well put together, but I think we can do this as a community and work our way through this with some of that grace that Jason was talking about earlier.
Yeah, I really appreciate this space and everybody coming out to talk today. I wish everyone the best in your endeavors, and just put in a plug for joining the Just Medicine Committee. If anybody's interested, you can reach out to Hannah to get more information on our meetings and what we're working on.
Great. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Stay tuned for more community conversations and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Stacy.
Thank you.